Hello everyone, and welcome to this Wednesday video kindly sponsored by Skillshare. You've probably seen or heard of them before, but just in case you haven't, Skillshare is an online learning community which contains a wide variety of skill-improving classes that everyone can benefit from. If you want to learn a new skill, advance an existing one, or just see how other people happen to make things work, there'll be a video for you. For fellow naval enthusiasts, such as myself, there are topics like illustration, photography, film and video, and many others. So whether you want to draw ships, photograph ships, or make videos about ships, there are tips, tricks, and techniques to discover. This month, Mrs. Drack brought it to my attention that some of the photos we're scanning in are quite small, which is understandable given their age, but it means that when you're expanding them, you notice small blemishes and such a lot more than you would with, say, an A5 or A4 sized photograph. And so I've been looking up this particular course by Kathleen Thorpe that teaches you how to restore old photos. Now, of course, the original scans will be made available as well, but a retouched version can't go amiss. And then you have this one by Dr. Ian Broinowski, I think, and he's talking about woodworking. You might think, well, what's that got to do with what you usually do, Drac? Well, I do have about 250 tiny 1:6000 scale miniatures from the Battle of Jutland that need to go in a display case so I don't start dropping them everywhere. There are no ads on the site, and if you want to go and have a look and see perhaps if there's something that you could make use of, the first 1,000 of you that click on the link in the description below will get a 1-month free trial of Skillshare, so you can start exploring your creativity today. So once again, thank you very much to Skillshare for sponsoring this video, and now on with the show. Hello everybody, welcome to yet another Wednesday video. As you may have guessed from the title, we're going to be talking about U-boats, but we're going to a slightly different theatre of operations as compared to the one that most people think about when they think about U-boats, which is of course the Atlantic. We're instead going to be talking about U-boats in the Black Sea. And to do that, well, there's not a tremendous amount that's been written in English about Black Sea U-boat operations. Turns out there has been some stuff written in German. Shockingly, I can't actually speak German or read it much beyond a high school level, so it's not much good for me. But of course, our wonderful colleague, Military History Visualized, has, he does speak German, weirdly enough. So he will be able to give us some more information about how these U-boats were transported there, what they did, etc. So in the extremely unlikely event that people who are listening to the channel don't know who you are, would you like to give yourself a bit of an intro?
Oh my god, an intro about myself. I'm from Austria. I'm 41 years old. I have a degree in history and in computer science, both masters. And yeah, in 2016 I created the channel Military History Visualized, and in 2018 I think I created Military History Not Visualized. And nowadays in the beginning I tried to keep make everything like naval history, ancient history, everything in there. But nowadays I focus mostly on German stuff because well, the market grew extensively. There's way more there, and I think this is where I can provide the most value, because a lot of people can read and speak English, but far less can read and speak German. I'm also trying to go in the archives for this one. I saw there's a book out there, because actually it was related. A friend sent me a photograph from Linz, where I live, from the harbor, where a U-boat was in the Linz harbor, and I was like, oh, I never did know they built U-boats here or put them together. And then I found there's a book out there. And then I asked you if you want to have a chat about this, and said yes. And then I ordered the book, and then I looked into it. And yeah, I got down the rabbit hole, because I also looked into the situations reports from the commander-in-chief of the Kriegsmarine to Hitler. And there was actually some case studies about these U-boat transports in the protocols, and it was quite well priced. And actually, yeah, I think I wandered off a bit, because it should be a short introduction.
No, it's all good. I like it when everything goes a little bit all over the place. It means I don't feel too bad about wandering off on tangents myself occasionally. So As those of you who have seen previous guest speaker videos will be familiar with, we're going to be going through a number of questions. So I guess we'll launch to question 1, which is when did the Kriegsmarine decide to send U-boats to the Black Sea?
So this is a bit difficult. There's a very short answer and the longer one. The short answer is basically between mid-February 1942 and mid-March 1942. So basically you could say at latest the decision was on 12th March 1942 because there's one of the protocols of the situations reports with the talks with Hitler. We also know on the 12th December 1941, so basically 2 to 3 months prior, Hitler was against transferring U-boats into the Black Sea. This is also in one of the protocols. So basically they usually met on the 12th or 13th of March, each month. And then they discussed it. And in 1941, in December, he was still against. But if you look at when it was first discussed and it first came up, was basically, I looked for preparations for Operation Barbarossa. The first time the Black Sea I could find in these situations reports was in February 1941. At that point, it was only mentioned that the Luftwaffe should conduct surprise attacks against Soviet naval bases in the Black Sea, and that Bulgaria and Romania should be supported with mines and coastal artillery. As previously mentioned, Hitler in December 1941 was against transferring submarines into the Black Sea. Now, the change likely came in January 1942, because in early January 1942, Soviet troops landed on the west coast of the Crimean Peninsula. And he ordered that transport capacity should be in Odessa to transfer a division to the Crimean Peninsula. Yet the Kriegsmarine responded that Odessa could not be used due to ice, that the Soviet minefields were unknown, that there were no ships to protect the transport ships, nor any icebreakers. Shortly thereafter, Hitler wanted to employ submarines in the Black Sea, and for that he wanted a cooperation with Turkey. This, of course, was quite complicated due to various reasons, including political ones. So there's a special treaty. And interesting enough, the commander-in-chief of the Kriegsmarine already on 8th of December 1941 ordered the preparation of the transfer of 5 U-boats into the Black Sea via the land Danube route. So it seems he preempted actually the decision, because Hitler around this was a bit later when he said, no, we don't send submarines there in December. So there's a bit more going on here. Okay. But already on the 18th of March 1941, in one of the situation reports, they have a protocol entry about transporting small German submarines to Romania across the land, and it would take about 4.5 to 5 months, and that they included something else. And so you could say the first thoughts were probably given in March 1941, but at the same time, at that protocol, you have a complete study there on basically 1 or 2 pages, how it's to be conducted. So one important aspect for the Kriegsmarine in March 1941 was they were against the transfer of these submarines because they assumed they wouldn't be operational to effect Operation Barbarossa. So they assumed that Operation Barbarossa would be successful or successful enough that their units wouldn't be needed. And then I found a bit of a discrepancy. I have basically 2 main sources. The one are the situation reports, and the other one is from Gerd Enders' Deutsche U-Boote zum Schwarzen Meer, German submarines to the Black Sea. And in that study, they basically note there's only one way to do it. Yet Enders wrote that there were 3 possibilities at one time, and then they decided the other one. The problem is I couldn't find his source for this. So I don't know if they did another study later on, or if it was done before.
Okay.
And so it's quite complicated. And basically, the question probably is also, why was this decision then finally taken in February or March 1942? Now, during Operation Barbarossa, it became apparent that the Soviet Black Sea Fleet was quite strong. So Odessa was encircled by German and Romanian forces, and in late September, the Soviets decided to evacuate Odessa. And they finished the evacuation in about mid-October 1941, and made it possible for about 80 to 86,000 soldiers and 15,000 civilians to be evacuated to Sevastopol, including a lot of heavy weapons as well. So this, of course, became rather apparent to the Germans that, well, if they can manage to evacuate that many people without much of them doing against it, that's quite a problem. So it seems it's a lot related to Case Blue, so the second German major offensive on the Eastern Front. So in 1942, they only attacked in the south area with Heeresgruppe Süd, whereas in 1941 they attacked with all three army groups. And basically, the army called for, we need supplies for Heeresgruppe Süd, and the requirement needs to be supplied via sea near the Dnieper estuary area. And then, of course, the Kriegsmarine said, yeah, well, there's a bit of a problem. The Black Sea Fleet is not unsubstantial, and we need to secure them. And we don't have any other vessels basically there besides the Romanian, and I think maybe, I don't know if the Bulgarians had anything. So likely at that point, at one point, it was decided. But again, Hitler said in December 1941, when they told him, okay, it will take, I think they told him it will take several months, whereas the actual transport is only a few weeks, but you need to decommission the ship, put it on the transport, bring it back, and recommission. So I don't know if recommission is the correct word. So it takes ages, and basically in December he was still nope. And then somewhere in February, March, the decision was taken to finally do it.
From in terms of an objection, because yeah, as you say, they've got to decommission it. They've got to take out any fuel, oil, etc. that might be in the systems, lubricants, etc. They've got to take it all apart, and then when they put it all back together and put all those things in, they are going to have to do a bit of a test voyage to make sure it's all back together properly. So it's going to take a lot longer than it just moving it from point A to point B. But I guess moving it from point A to point B brings us on to our second question, which is what kinds of transport options did they consider before actually settling on the ones that they would end up using?
So the options were limited. They had the study from the appendix from 18th March 1941. So it's basically they have experience with World War I, and they used the UB1, which only had 125 long tons, and they could use this via train. But above 250 long tons, you can only do it as in part. And the U-2B, which they decided on, is about 250 tons. So they had no small U-boats in production, and so they need to use existing ones. And a difference to the World War I U-boats was also these had riveted hulls, now they were welded. Thus, they needed to transport the complete pressure hull, which is not possible via train because the diameter is about 4 meters and the length was about 27 to 30 meters. As such, they needed to use the Reichsautobahn, so the Reichshighway, and river transport. They had already some experience with transporting tank ships on the Danube, so oilers, I think, which happened in October 1939 to Romania. And they took into consideration basically U-Boote U1 to U6 and U7 to U24. And another limit was the Reichsautobahn had a limit of 145 long tons. So this meant they need to remove the machinery and nearly everything from the boat that you come down to 145 tons. What they also did, they turned the U-boat to reduce the height, and the conning tower also needed to be removed. And then there was basically one point only where they could transfer it from the river to the Reichsautobahn and back again. The one was at Übigau, south of Dresden. They know that it's only possible there, sadly no explanation. And here's the interesting part, which I mentioned previously, because Anders noted 3 alternatives for the overland transport. He noted 1, Heilbronn to Stuttgart, short tunnel in the Drachensteiner mountain, but that's too small. Then Dessau-Ingolstadt required building of a towing facility and 500 meters access to road, too expensive and too time-consuming. And the third one, which was taken, which is Dresden-Ingolstadt. This also required some construction work, but apparently the least amount. And another issue was that drafts of the sub were too deep for the Elbe or Danube, so they put them on pontons. And the duration was about 9 weeks, whereas 2 weeks, about plus 2 weeks on the upper Danube waiting time due to highly varying water levels. So the total duration, although the total duration in December 1941 is given with 10 months. This is when Hitler said, no, that's too long, or he basically disagreed back then. But this includes the reconstruction. They also discussed a complete alternative, and this is the Finnish mini-sub with about 100 tons, but that only had a range of about 375 nautical miles. And this could have been transported with railway. I forgot the name of the sub. I think I have mentioned it somewhere else. You might probably know it.
Yeah, so it's almost verging on a miniature sub at that point. So they've got a number of different options there, and you mentioned they went for a particular route. So what were the options that they actually used, and the start and end points of those actual transportation routes that they settled on?
So basically a starting point were the home bases of the subs. These were training U-boats because they were built in 1934, 1945. There was Gotenhafen and Pillau. Pillau is near Königsberg, and Gotenhafen is, I think, a bit more to the south. And then they were moved to Kiel for decommission and disassembly. And from there, they were transported to Hamburg via the Kaiser Wilhelm Channel. And then was the second water transport was from Hamburg to Dresden-Übigau on the Elbe River. And then from Dresden to Ingolstadt on a highway, on the Reichsautobahn. And then there's a difference. We have two groups. We have the first group with 3 subs, and then another one later with another 3 subs. The first group went from Ingolstadt to Linz, where they added the machinery and the conning tower. And then they traveled along the Danube. And from Linz then to Galatz or Galati. And from Galati then to Sulina, which is, and from Galati to Sulina, either under own power or towed on the Danube to the Danube Delta at Sulina, and then to the harbor in Constanta. And the second group basically skipped Linz. They went from Ingolstadt to Galati. And they were basically then put together in Galati.
Oh, that sounds very interesting, because so they've obviously got concerns at that point, as you mentioned earlier, about just the weight that's involved. So the overland transport section, they're not actually, even though the hulls are welded together, so they've got to send them as a whole thing. They're keeping machinery and conning towers, basically almost anything they can detach away from it all, and then installing them once they're in the water at that point. That's I suppose it makes sense, but it shows. I guess it shows even with the routes they've chosen, just how much on right on the edge of the margin they are in terms of the loading. And speaking of that, were there any problems or limitations they experienced in that transportation process?
So the weight limitations for the highway were basically 140, but they used 2 vehicles, and each could carry 70 tons. And so only type 2A and B were viable. They chose type B. And for the height of the land transport, it was a maximum of 4.35 meters. As such, bridges with less clearing were a problem. So in some cases, then they moved around certain areas. And disassembly was required. Here I have a complete list of what they did. The machinery, including battery, needs to be removed. Removal parts of the upper deck, conning tower, rudder, depth rudder, propeller removed. Then a special construction for the transport was made, a construction of pontons for the water transport as well. Then they needed some adaptations to the slipways, and then reconstruction in Linz or in Galati. And in some cases, the bridges on the water transport were some problems, like with high water, like they mentioned the Föhringer Brücke, and one time the S-shaped rapids where they had to be careful. And they also mentioned that for the Steinerne Brücke in Regensburg, there was little space, so they needed to watch the water level and also be careful about the speed. I think there was a special kind of rapid that basically slowed down. There were some pictures in there, and they had an arrow to describe in the book by Anders how the water flowed and everything. So I think it was quite complicated, but basically I think it was mentioned that everything turned out fine. I mean, they apparently did their homework, and it seems they take care of everything.
I would have loved to have seen the idea of somebody trying to take a U-boat over rapids. That would have been absolutely great. Whitewater U-boating. I don't think that's something anyone's ever thought of before.
Yeah.
And I suppose it is interesting that you mentioned with the sort of, with the water levels on the Danube changing so radically. It's not something that people can tend to consider, because ports tend to be sited in areas where, for the most part, especially military ports, where the tidal difference isn't that great, or if it is quite great, then there's still a substantial amount of deep water for the ships or the subs to be in, whereas on the Danube you don't have that choice. It's the water level is what it is, and the level of the riverbed isn't going to change, so you may end up in some fairly shallow water.
Yeah, and the bridges in some cases, I mean, Steinerne Brücke, I assume, which means basically stone bridge, I assume it's a rather old bridge, and it's probably of brick and mortar, so there's not much you can do either.
No. Well, I suppose with a U-boat, they've probably got a few options for ducking under it that normal ships don't have, assuming that the riverbed is deep enough for them at that point.
But they were all transported on pontons at that point, so that the U-boat lay 90 degrees sideways on a ponton, so there was not much they could do if it stuck out too much. But I mean, they removed the conning tower and everything.
Yeah, fair enough. So so that one is the same kind of restrictions they're facing. So I guess that comes on to, so how many U-boats did they send? And we've mentioned a couple of the types, but how many overall did they send, and what were the types of those various U-boats?
So basically 6 in total, 2 times 3, and all were Type 2B. All were built in 1934 and 1945. Some technical data, basically they had a weight of about, according to Wikipedia, 275 long tons, whereas Anders notes, weight officially 250 tons. So surface speed about 13 knots, submerged 7 knots. Both agree here on the range is basically 3,100 nautical miles, which is about 5,700 kilometers and 3,600 miles. Test depth 150 meters, regular about 80 meters. And the crew is given with 3 officers, 11 NCOs, and 11 enlisted men, whereas, interesting enough, Anders lists 2 different numbers. For 1943, he notes the same, 3 officers and 22 men, whereas for 1944, he notes 4 officers and 28 men. So I don't know how, because this is quite a lot more men. So we have 32, that's 7 more men, and these submarines are not particularly big, so I don't know why and how they did this. And in terms of armament, we're speaking about 5 torpedoes and 18 mines, and 1 2-centimeter anti-aircraft gun. And in 1944, they added a second 2-centimeter twin anti-aircraft gun. So this is not really comparable to a Type 7 U-boat, which has, I think, an 88 millimeter gun at least, and a way more torpedoes as well.
Yeah, I suppose one of the things that's interesting to note is that actually the underwater speed of, although that it's, as you say, it's not a Type 7, it's smaller, it's got far less weaponry, it's nowhere near as capable in terms of range or surface top speed, but it actually has a similarly comparable top speed to a Type 7 when it's underwater. So in its attack profile, I guess it's poses a similar level of danger. It's just not going to necessarily get into an attack profile quite as often because of those restrictions on it.
Basically, for the specific U-boats, it was U9, U19, 24, then 18, then 20, and 23. The first two were transferred April 1942 to October 1942. The third one, May 1942 to December 1942, and the next two were August 1942 to June 1943. One arrived in May, and the other one was October 1942 to June 1943.
So it wasn't too many U-boats overall, and they're not sending any of the bigger types. So I guess you've got this small collection, half a dozen, effectively what would be anywhere else defined as coastal submarines. What actual level of success did they have in the Black Sea?
So first of some operational dates to outline it. So the first operation started in the 22nd of October with U-24, and it ended with the scuttling of U-19 during the night of the 11th September 1944. So in total, we have about 1,460 days at sea with 56 patrols. And officially, 26 ships were sunk with a total of 45,426 gross registered tons. So I think you can put this in better context than I can. Most of the ships were rather small from what I've seen from the tables.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, I can't really, I'm a landlubber, as you know, so I can't really put this in a context if this can be considered successful or not.
Yeah.
And I haven't seen any assessments neither. In late 1943, a German vice admiral commented on the rather limited successes of the German submarines. He noted that the Soviets, after losing several bigger transport ships, switched to smaller units like coastal freighters, which were both hard to hit and also of limited value.
So when you compare that to the overall tonnage figures from all German submarines, obviously primarily occupied in the Battle of the Atlantic, you find that the 6 submarines committed to the Black Sea sunk an average of just over 7,500 tons apiece. But surprisingly, despite obviously a considerably larger number of merchant vessels being sunk in the Atlantic and other theatres, the overall figure for the U-boat arm in general isn't actually that much higher. It's just over 12,200 tons per U-boat being of shipping sunk. Now, obviously, you do have to take that into a little bit more context. The subs in the Black Sea don't become operational until kind of the mid-war period, and that's the time when the average tonnage per U-boat sunk in the Atlantic is actually very high. It started off low at the beginning of the war and obviously would trend down much lower towards the end of the war as well. So on a basis of the primary operational period when the Black Sea U-boats are going around, it's substantially lower. The ratio is much less favourable to them than an overall picture of the war as a whole might otherwise suggest. And of course, you have to factor in that there are going to be some submarine commanders, the really high scoring ones, that are going to skew that overall average a little bit up for the entire Kriegsmarine as compared to the rather limited numbers of U-boats operating on the Black Sea, none of which had spectacular levels of success. But one of the other things you have to keep in mind is the type of vessels being sunk. Because if you are a U-boat commander, say, in the Atlantic, and you manage to sink a 12 or 15,000 ton transport or tanker, and perhaps you're in the Black Sea and you sink 12 to 15,000 tons of small coastal freighters, that tanker probably was actually carrying far, far, far more cargo than all of the smaller ships put together, just because, again, of the efficiencies of the square cube law. Plus, of course, to a certain degree, obviously, Liberty ship production lines being what they are, small coastal ships are much easier to replace than big ocean-going freighters and tankers.
And at one point I wrote down, or it seems at one point, an objective was intercepting the supply of Soviet troops on the Crimean Peninsula that landed behind the German troops. But as mentioned before, it likely changed a few times, because it seems when it finally got going, because this happened earlier, it was likely because to protect supply for the army, but I couldn't find the reason exactly why it was sent, why they were sent.
So if I suppose with that data, do we know all that much about whether or not the U-boats they sent actually did the job and matched the operational needs that had been identified in the Black Sea that had caused any U-boats at all to be sent in the first place?
In late February 1942, there was a directive that outlined the main objectives of the German units in the Black Sea. Note that this included transport ships, E-boat, minesweepers, and other small vessels, not just U-boats. An early establishment of supply lines to the South Ukraine, Crimean Peninsula, and further east. B. Measures to secure the transport of supply. C. Support of the army during the conquest of Sevastopol, the Kerch Peninsula, and the defense of the Crimean Peninsula. D. Preventing a landing of Soviet troops behind German lines. You have the problem they only had mostly torpedoes, not mines, so only 5 torpedoes and a 20mm A gun, so very limited capabilities. According to the kill tables I could look at, torpedoes were mostly used a few times. Guns and scuttling charges were also used. And funnily enough, they also did testing of rockets fired from submarines, both surfaced and submerged. That was completely new to me.
Mm-hmm.
About torpedoes, there's a very interesting aspect that I haven't seen before, so you can probably elaborate on that a bit more. In June 1942, the first German E-boats were used, yet the success with torpedoes was limited. As a reason, it is noted that Meeresleuchten, which is the Milky Seas effect according to Wikipedia, made it very easy to spot torpedoes. To quote Wikipedia on the effect, Milky Seas, also called Mareal, is a luminous phenomenon in the ocean in which large areas of seawater appear to glow translucently in various shades of blue. Such occurrences glow brightly enough at night to be visible from satellite orbiting Earth. So sadly, I don't know if this really affects torpedo spotting or not, but I'm rather sure you know.
So what's being described here is called the glowing seas effect in other places, and it takes place when various life forms, plankton, bacteria, something like that, that have photoluminescent or bioluminescent properties become agitated in some way. Now, sometimes this can be a fairly low level of agitation. You can just get generically glowing patches on the sea. But quite often, anyone who's been at sea in waters where this occurs, it's more common in tropical waters, but can occur in much colder waters, such as the Black Sea or even the North Sea. When a ship moves through it, then instead of just getting the foam that you get with a wake, you also get, as you can see with this vessel, a glow. Now, of course, that means that if you're firing a torpedo at night, the torpedo has its own propellers, it's going to be motoring along through. So instead of having a torpedo happily bubbling along and perhaps no one being much the wiser, you're going to instead have this bioluminescent streak coming through the water, which is going to fairly quickly inform anybody with a working pair of eyes that something rather interesting and perhaps rather dangerous is going on.
And they were used against mostly Soviet Caucasus coastal shipping and attacked sometimes transport ships, and basically they were seen as a stopgap measure. And another issue is that the Black Sea Fleet was quite strong in the beginning, yet they also had substantial losses. For instance, in October 1943, due to a Stuka attack, 3 out of the 6 or 7 modern destroyers of the Black Sea were sunk, or the Black Sea Fleet was sunk. And overall, the balance of force was way more on the Soviet side. I mean, they had old battleships, old cruisers, old destroyers, whereas Romania basically had 4 destroyers, a few E-boats, cannon boats, and the Soviets in total had in the beginning 44 subs, which included training subs, but the problem is the operational range, but alone 625 aircraft for naval aviation. So bit hard to see what they could do. It's actually quite interesting that they survived basically till the very end.
Yeah, I suppose. Well, a lot of the Black Sea Fleet ended up involved in the Stalingrad siege and Sevastopol, trying to run supplies to and from, and suffered from the Luftwaffe accordingly. I suppose there's not that many of them, but there is a bit of a deterrent effect because once you know that there are enemy submarines operating in an area. So yeah, if I'm trying to put myself in the shoes of the commander of the Black Sea Fleet, if I've got to worry about Luftwaffe aircraft as pretty much the only surface threat outside of a handful of destroyers to my surface fleet, then I can think about running supply lines, supply chains, and maybe even undertaking some offensive bombardments and such, because the only thing I then have to worry about is, can I get the Air Force to give me some fighter cover, or do I trust my anti-aircraft guns enough? Which, I mean, it's not exactly a simple problem, but it is a single-axis problem, whereas the minute somebody gets torpedoed, now you've got to worry about all of that from the air, and then also the possibility that a sub might just pop up and torpedo your battleship or cruiser that you're using for shore bombardment, which now then means you've got to enact all sorts of anti-submarine warfare protocols, which for the most part, okay, admittedly in part due to lack of need, the Soviet Navy wasn't especially brilliant at. So I suppose that they might have had a very outsized effect for their size, but we probably need to find someone who reads Russian to tell us that if any of the Black Sea archives have survived.
Yeah, it definitely added something along those lines, and I think that the losses, the three destroyer that were lost to the Stuka, that if I remember correctly, that led to a severe okay, don't risk our fleet anymore in this.
Yeah. Well, I remember when I was doing research for the video on the Soviet super destroyer, the Tashkent, when it came under air attack, its AA armament, even though it was a super destroyer, so it was pretty big, its overall anti-aircraft battery was so anemic that the only reason it survived at all for as long as it did was essentially because it could move so quickly that it was kind of throwing off the aim of the bombers who were more used to dealing with a destroyer that could travel somewhere in the low to mid 30s of knots, as opposed to a destroyer that at least on paper could top out well over 40. Because they certainly weren't being deterred by its anti-aircraft battery.
Yeah.
I think from one account I read, they reckoned if they'd actually got some of the evacuating wounded Red Army soldiers to shoot their rifles randomly into the sky, they thought that probably would have had a better chance of hitting something than I think it was a 40 or 47 millimeter AA gun they had mounted on the stern that had a rate of fire more comparable to a field artillery piece than an AA gun.
Yeah, that's a bit of a problem against the Stuka.
Yeah. So once they've transported these 6 U-boats down there, was there any consideration or effort to try and establish a local U-boat production at locations that wouldn't require this expensive overland transport, assembly, etc., and then obviously rebuilding and recommissioning?
I found 2 aspects about this. I start with the later one because that's actually more direct related.
Mm-hmm.
So for the 13th February 1942, I found a report about production of E-boats in Linz. And they did a study here, and it's basically Linz has no facilities to construct E-boats, and it would require 3 months of preparation and the select of skilled workers. They had to be transferred from northern Germany. And then they assumed that the construction of an E-boat would require 6.5 months by a skilled crew. In Linz, it would require at least 8 months. And the best first E-boat to finish in Linz, that would be then in January 1943. So since an E-boat is likely a bit easier to produce than a U-boat, and they would need to transfer even for an E-boat the skilled workers from Germany, from the harbors and everything, and the shipyards, I assume that U-boat production in Linz or somewhere else would be completely off. Yet I also found for the 18th of March a study about the transfer, which previously mentioned, of the U-boats. There they also mentioned, they had a short passage about Romanian U-boats, and they noted the Delfinul from the 650 long-ton submarine, which was built from 1927 to 1931 at the Italian shipyard, yet only commissioned in 1936 for the Romanian Navy. And they particularly noted they only have 12 operational Whitehead torpedoes. There were 20 more in storage for E-boats, yet no more torpedoes of that type could be made available. And they also know, okay, the problem with this torpedo is it creates bubbles, so it's not really suited for their operations. And the German torpedoes are too large, so they would have to refit the Devinul, which would take several months. And then they also referred to a U-boat in Galati, likely the Marsuinul, which was commissioned in May 1943, and a mine U-boat, likely the Rechinul, which had its first mission in 1944. And they noted those two U-boats were of German design and are likely finished in November 1941. But if these are correct, as mentioned, they were in May, and in 1944 they were finished. And they were also equipped with Whitehead torpedo launchers or launchers or tubes, and there was a conversion plan to German torpedoes. So there was also mentioned a mine U-boat with English mines, but those couldn't be procured anymore, and German mine types of that size likely would take a conversion of 24 months. I don't know why. I guess they were so different. And generally noted that best with German crews, they could be operational in the end of February. So the alternative to use Romanian submarines was discussed, but nothing was done. Then there was also at one point a mention of a preparation of building a U-boat type 23, which was an electronic coastal sub. This was done in 1943, yet it was not done. So those were basically all the alternatives I could find that were related to that.
Yeah, I must admit, refitting things, refitting shipping is a long-ish process. It's not quite, but almost as long if you're doing a deep refit as actually just building a new one. The main difference is it's usually cheaper, and it occupies space and resources that are somewhat different from the building or a brand new vessel. But submarines and anything like that, when you're talking about torpedo tube equipped vessels with a pressure hull, that does tend to take a long time, because at least with a surface vessel, you obviously you don't want to be too careless, but to a certain extent you can just kind of cut plates away and then replace them. Whereas with a submarine, if you're doing anything internally that requires you to cut open the pressure hull, that's going to be a lot harder, because pressure hulls are designed to prevent things from coming through them. But once you've done that, you also, now that you've compromised it, you can't just weld a patch on and call it good. You've basically got to replace that whole section at a minimum. And given, as you said earlier, that they're welded instead of riveted, you'd have to be incredibly careful about exactly where you're trying to unweld and re-weld things. It would be a lot easier if they were riveted, but even then it wouldn't be particularly pleasant. I mean, who wants to be the first person to take a submarine out to sea where they say, we cut the bow off and we changed it all around, but we think it's a back together all right. That's not a prospect I would enjoy. So I guess that brings us to our final question. What happened to all these U-boats? I mean, presumably there were some war losses, but if so, what were they, and what happened to the ones that survived, if any?
Well, it depends how you define survived, but let's get through a list, because it's actually quite interesting. In some cases, I was quite surprised about how much we actually know. So let's begin with U-9. U-9 was lost in Constanza harbor after the bombing attack on the 12th August 1944. On the 22nd October 1944, it was recovered by the Soviet Black Sea Fleet. And in end March of 1945 was repaired at the dock and then moved to the shipyard in Nikolaev. And on the 19th of April 1945, it was added as TC-16 to the Soviet Black Sea Fleet, and in October 1945 to Sevastopol and added to the training flotilla. So I was quite surprised that they used that, but already in November 1945, it was removed from the flotilla and scrapped. And there's also one minor detail. U-9 had a large iron cross on its conning tower, which apparently was salvaged and was located at least around in 2001 in the Navy Museum in Sevastopol and probably is still there. So then we have U-18 and U-24. On the 12th of August 1944, both were also heavily damaged in the bombing attack. And on the 25th of August, both were scuttled. On the 25th of August, there was also the Romanian declaration of war against Germany. And in end of 1944, recovery of U-18 by the Soviet Black Sea Fleet also brought to Sevastopol, and in spring 1945, they recovered U-24 and was also brought to Sevastopol. The reconstruction failed, and both were sunk on the 26th of May 1945 by the Soviet submarine M120. Now, U-19, U-20, and U-23. U-19 was also heavily damaged, but on the 25th of August, when the Romanians declared war, it left the harbor and joined U-20 and U-23, which were still outside. Then U-20 and U-23 scuttled on the 10th of September near Turkey, and U-19 scuttled as the last ship near Turkey and on 11th September 1944. And there's also some minor information on the fate of the crews. The crews of U-9, U-18, and U-24 reached Germany via Bulgaria and Yugoslavia in September 1944. So they actually made it back. I don't know how, but yeah. And 2 crewmen were killed by partisans in Yugoslavia. And the crews of U-19, U-20, and U-23 were interned in Turkey and left on the 21st of July 1946 to Italy, and were prisoners of war in Germany until the 24th of September 1946.
Surprising number of them, at least physically, are still intact at the end of the war. Just perhaps not necessarily in the best of conditions.
So yeah, they were apparently only damaged or heavily damaged enough while in the harbor during the bombing attack. So shortly before Romania dropped out of the war or changed side in the war, however you want to call it.
And I suppose that, to a certain extent, illustrates the difference in the anti-submarine environment in the Black Sea as opposed to in the North Sea and the Atlantic. Because, I mean, obviously, yes, there were a lot of U-boats that were still left at the end of World War II, but they were only a small proportion of the total launched, whereas, yeah, the Russians didn't really succeed very much in any anti-submarine warfare efforts against these ships. That brings us to the end of our little round of questions. Once again, thank you very much for looking into all this for us and translating it all out of the German, which is obviously going to be an extra layer of work. So I hope everyone else has enjoyed this little chat about U-boats in the Black Sea. And if you'd like to know more about, we've probably exhausted most of what can be said about this particular little subject, but if you'd like to know more about German operations and such like, and you like this particular format, please let us know in the comments below and we can keep this ongoing. And once again, thank you very much for your work and hope to see everyone again in another video.
Thank you for having me.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.